Brewmaster Monks are really strong and fun in Mythic Plus right now. Their damage is excellent, second only to Demon Hunters. They're surprisingly good at self-healing, they have powerful cooldowns, and great group utility. They're also the least popular tank in Mythic Plus, by a good margin. Why? What happened? And is it even worth playing Monk if it's so unpopular? Hi, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to answer these questions and more as I go over how to play Brewmaster Monk in Dragonflight patch 10.2.5. Since it's the middle of the season, this will be specifically oriented toward Mythic Plus, and with that being said, let's just get right into it. Let's start by talking about Monk's strengths. First off, damage. Monk deals a massive amount of damage. This isn't a new development, but in the past it's usually been a component of the class balance that's offset by being flimsy. The equation for Monk was do a lot of damage, be weak, and need a lot of external healing. That's really not a successful combination most of the time, but it's not really a problem right now due to Monk's number 2 big strength, self-healing. It finally happened. We are so back. Monk has legitimately very good self-healing tools in the current state of the game, and they are bolstered by a really effective tier set bonus that adds a lot of damage and self-healing as well. And finally, Monk has great group utility. It's right on par with Bear Druids when it comes to dealing with Mythic Plus affixes. It has amazing crowd control tools for shutting down packs of annoying enemies. It's an absolute all-star of group utility, right? Well, it should be, but let's move on to the problems with the class, and we'll start with problem number 1, the stupid debuff matrix. The debuff matrix is the worst design decision Blizzard has made in the past 10 years. I realize that's controversial. They made Legion Legendaries and Azerite armor during this time. They made Corruption, and they assigned the Shadowlands Covenant system to be the whole locked-in thing at the start of the expansion. But I think the debuff matrix has actually done more harm to the player base than all of those other decisions. Class communities in Raid and Mythic Plus comps have been completely constrained by the existence of the debuff matrix. It was a thing that didn't need to come back. It's pretty simple. Most of the DPS specs in the game deal magic damage. All the casters do. Just doing a simple eye test, about 13 of the 23 DPS specs in WoW deal virtually all magic damage. About 6 of them deal predominantly physical damage, and the remaining 4 to 5 deal a mix of the two. Monk debuffs enemies with 5% more physical damage taken, and Demon Hunters debuff enemies with 5% more magical damage taken. It's a no-brainer. Monk's debuff is worse. In raids, it adds about 30,000 DPS. In Mythic Plus, that number is way less, potentially almost nothing if you're not playing with a specifically stacked physical damage group comp. Demon Hunter's Chaos brand is an order of magnitude stronger than Monk's Mystic Touch, despite them both providing 5% more of a type of damage because one type is far more common than the other. So unless you're playing exclusively with like warriors and hunters, Monk's debuff is bad. Now that probably is enough just on its own to make it unpopular at the highest ends of play, but not necessarily throughout the rest of the game. Unfortunately, there is more. Problem number 2, Brewmaster Monks are too complex for average players. Monk has so many rotational keybinds, more than any other tank, more than it needs. This is a problem, and if the reward was insane amounts of damage or being completely unkillable, yeah, okay. I think the high end of players would be able to accept that. Minor spoiler alert for the Demon Hunter video, players have been just fine with Vengeance Demon Hunter having a ton more keybinds now. So why isn't Monk thriving? Because it has all this complexity, all this extra work required to play it, and the end result is pretty good. This is important. I don't want to be gloomy here or say you shouldn't play this class. It's my favorite. I love it. It's fun. It's pretty good. That's great. If it were pretty good and like relaxing and chill to play, that would be an amazing combo. Easy to sell. It wouldn't be last place on the popularity meters. It's hard work for a pretty good result, and that could be better. And finally, problem number 3. Monk has the wrong kind of crowd control. It's really that simple. Monk's main crowd control tools are Leg Sweep, Paralysis, and Ring of Peace. These are all great tools. They are. The problem with them, especially with Leg Sweep, is that they are all extremely generic. Most classes have a stun now. The stun diminishing return is a good thing for the health of the game. I don't think it should be taken away. but it does mean that leg sweep will apply the stun DR to enemies, so stacking stuns into a group, which is really easy to do, isn't a good way to deal with mobs that have annoying casts or spam cast spells that are really dangerous. Someone's got to come up with a better way. Someone did, and it's called Silence. Demon Hunter and Protection Paladin have ways to blanket silence enemy casters, and they are the top 2 most popular tank specs in Mythic Plus. Coincidence? Of course not. Season 3's Mythic Plus dungeons are rotten with caster mobs. Leg Sweep, Paralysis, and Ring of Peace are all great on their own, but they do not shut down casters. Sigil of Silence and Avenger Shield do. End of story, really. I do not think that every other tank needs to copy Demon Hunter and Paladin's ability to shut down casters. I think that would be boring and make the game worse. But until Blizzard either stops making dungeons that are loaded with dangerous caster mobs or gives the other tanks some kind of special utility of their own, which could be damage. If you just did 25% more damage on a monk than you do on a paladin, that would be good enough. But until something like that changes, there isn't really any way to break the stranglehold that Paladin and Demon Hunter have on the tanking scene. Okay, I want to move on to affixes. Monks are amazing at dealing with Mythic Plus affixes. I would put them right in between Bear Druids and Paladins as top tier just specs in the entire game for dealing with Mythic Plus affixes. You can easily shut down incorporeal adds with Paralysis. You can dispel afflicted NPCs. You can use Tiger's Lust on yourself or on the healer to clear entangling without having to move. During Spiteful Week, you can slow the Spiteful adds. You can leg sweep them, you can Ring of Peace them, or you can just AoE them down, or some combination of all of those. On Sanguine Weeks, you can Ring of Peace enemies out of the Sanguine pools pretty easily. The main weakness for monks is bursting. You can't do anything to help the group with it, and in a lot of situations, such as the first half of the Everbloom, your amazing AoE damage output can make the problem a lot worse. Bursting is far and away the most annoying affix to deal with as a monk because your defensive power is reliant on dealing damage, and the affix forces you to cool your jets, which is counterproductive. You can kite if you need to, that is an option, but it is an option that sucks. Bursting sucks, affixes suck, everyone hates them. Brewmaster Monk tier set bonuses are actually pretty decent for Mythic Plus this season. I spent the last several months playing with them, and they definitely suck in raids, to the point that I didn't play Monk and Amir Drasil primarily because the tier set bonus was so bad. But with that being said, I've actually become a pretty huge fan of them in Mythic Plus, and I'm happy that they are sticking around into Season 4. And here they are. The 2-piece makes Breath of Fire deal 40% bonus damage as Shadow Flame, and it causes you to heal for 50% of all fire damage dealt. The 4-piece bonus gives your attacks against targets afflicted by Breath of Fire a chance to deal 15% extra damage as Shadow Flame. This number's a little low. It also causes Celestial Brew to grant a stagger absorb shield equal to the amount of Shadow Flame damage that you have dealt. Healing for 50% of all the fire damage you deal is legitimately amazing in Mythic Plus. It really adds up to a ton of healing over the course of a dungeon, and it's a steady supply of healing, which really helps fix the issue of Monk needing so much external healing all the time. I do feel significantly more self-sufficient since getting this tier set bonus. It's been pretty good. Mechanically, the 4-piece bonus shield passively absorbs some stagger damage when you cast Celestial Brew. It's a bit funky. Technically speaking, it absorbs stagger damage from hits you take while the shield is active, preventing them from being added into your current stagger pool. The wording is confusing, but basically all you need to know is when you press the shield button, you get even more shield. They put a shield in the shield. It's fine. In Mythic Plus, the tier set adds about 8 to 10% more damage. This is okay. I would prefer more, especially more single target damage from the tier set. Really, it's not quite enough, but it works pretty well, and the defensive component is really good. Now I'm going to talk about talents, and I have one main talent setup to consider here with a small tweak that can have a huge impact on your rotation. Alright, here I have a standard talent setup for Mythic Plus for Brewmaster Monk. In the left-hand tree, there are a couple of things that we can move around, depending on the personal preference, but this is the more standard setup. And in the right-hand tree, I would say there's really only 2 talents that you can swap around, or that you see swapped around particularly often, and I'll just jump into those right now. In the left-hand tree, you have the choice of Yu'lon's Grace, which is just a really, really nice passive bonus that gives you shielding against magic damage, and it just stacks up whenever you're in combat. It's a pretty good, consistent amount of damage reduction, and I mean, what more can you say? It's really good. It helps you with something that you kind of struggle with, which is sustained spell damage on a monk. That is kind of dangerous, and this basically offsets that. By comparison, you have diffuse magic, which is great in raids, great in situations where you have this sort of guaranteed burst of magic damage and then no real magic damage outside of that window. The problem is that that's just not how Mythic Plus damage models work. So Yulon's Grace is basically a perfect counter for the type of spell damage you take in Mythic Plus, and diffuse magic is not at all. So pretty much a no-brainer to always take Yulon's Grace, but diffuse magic is there if you feel that you specifically need it. It's an option you can take, but it's harder to use correctly and kind of worse even most of the time when you do. Same sort of situation with Dance of the Wind, which just gives you 10% dodge chance, but you dodge a lot of attacks, and this gets added on top of that. It really does add up to a lot less damage taken in Mythic Plus on a Brewmaster Monk. It's still quite a lot of damage reduction just to get a passive 10% dodge chance, and the alternative is Dampen Harm, which is a 2-minute defensive cooldown. It only lasts for 10 seconds. It's a decent amount of damage reduction when it's active. It can be useful at the start of pulls. You're taking a lot of damage, getting anywhere from 20 to 50% damage reduction on all those hits is nice, but you could just be taking 10% fewer auto attacks all the time. That kind of, I mean, that adds up to be a lot more damage reduction over the course of an entire dungeon than you get out of Dampen Harm. So it's pretty hard to actually find situations where Diffuse and Dampen wind up being better than their passive counterparts, and that's kind of a good thing. It really has offset some of the massive explosion of complexity that Brewmaster Monk encountered at the very start of the expansion. Things aren't still, they're not totally perfect. The offensive end of things, the amount of skills you have for your rotation, but in terms of defensive cooldowns, I think that Brewmaster Monk really settled down kind of midway through the expansion with the addition of these passives. Really good move. All right, down here in the class tree, you have Summon White Tiger statue, which it's a talent that everybody kind of has to take. You throw it down. It's very basic. You throw it down at the start of AoE pulls. It does a bunch of AoE damage. It is a pretty large source of your damage in some burst situations. It's so insanely boring. Mechanically, no interaction, just really the most boring thing in the world. You set it down and it radiates damage. It sucks so much. I would love to see all that damage merged into the baseline components of the class and just have this killed entirely. I really hate the monk class tree just generically. You have to take Soothing Mist in order to come over here and get like these useful talents. It's a literally worthless skill. They could swap Improved Roll and Soothing Mist, and I think that would be a massive quality of life improvement for Windwalker and Brewmaster Monk. The fact that all of the capstones suck, like Summon White Tiger statue is mechanically boring, but at least numerically valuable. But Summon Jade Serpent statues worthless for Windwalker and Brewmaster Monk, and I don't know. I assume not great for Mistweaver. And Black Ox statue kind of worthless for Brewmaster, Windwalker, and Mistweaver most of the time, unless you're like AoE farming out in the world. They botched it with a lot of the class tree stuff. But there are some really good things in here, like these choice nodes between your defensive cooldowns and being able to pick up celerity, get that extra cooldown on roll, and reduce cooldown is pretty good. Also, there's a lot of damage in here, which is nice, and not having to go very far to pick up your Dispel. That's pretty good. All right, now let's move on to the spec tree. And in the spec tree, there are a handful of things that some people will swap around. Like there's a common question that's asked, can you run Special Delivery instead of Rushing Jadewind? Absolutely. It will do a little less damage, but it's somewhat competitive. The bigger issue for me is Rushing Jadewind. If I just close that out here, hit Rushing Jadewind, as you can see, it's radiating Jadewind around me the whole time. So at the start of pulls, that constant damage, that constant ticking a couple times a second really helps with establishing initial threat. It's something I really, really value about Rushing Jadewind, and you're obviously not going to get that out of Special Delivery. There is a delay on the Special Delivery going up in the air and coming down. You have to actually press Purifying Brew or Celestial Brew in order for that brew to get thrown up in the air, so it's not nearly as useful for the sort of easing the transition into starting pulls. Also, Rushing Jadewind is just very familiar to me at this point, and for a lot of monks, it's the better option. And it certainly is a lot more familiar when it comes to using it to like fill holes in your rotation, really. If we come down further in the tree, Bob and Weave is a bit easier of a choice than Black Ox Brew. Now, Black Ox Brew is a really good like safety belt. It's a real good defensive layer to have. Just makes you a lot safer to be able to Celestial Brew and then immediately Black Ox Brew and Celestial Brew again. But if you're really starting out, if you're uncomfortable, or if you're just being kind of lazy with it, you can run Bob and Weave instead. It basically just makes your stagger damage take longer to do damage to you, so you kind of wind up taking a bit less damage all the time. And the only thing you're really sacrificing to accomplish that is weird defensive cooldown. A defensive cooldown, frankly, that's pretty good, but it is like, you know, it's kind of a couple of keybinds to get yourself that actual damage reduction, that damage shielding value, whereas you could just have passive damage reduction all the time. Not a ton of it, but a little bit. So both of these are actually pretty good. In high level play, Black Ox Brew is always the accepted choice because it gives you more control over your damage reduction, and that really is what's most important. Prehensive Instability is an absolute must-have talent. I just wanted to point it out because, as you can see, it says it gives you 15% dodge for 5 seconds after you use Purifying Brew or Celestial Brew, and this sort of encourages you to consistently use Purifying Brew, but also to stagger them out. You know, if you're double tapping Purifying Brew, Celestial Brew, you're using them within a couple seconds of each other, which if you need to do that to live, specifically with getting Celestial Brew out at the right time, that's fine. But in terms of pressing Purifying Brew, it really encourages you to use it kind of as a staggered out thing, at least every 6 seconds, but more like every 8 or so. That really is a good design that kind of flows nicely with the rest of the spec. And over here we have Dragonfire Brew and Charred Passions. This is a really important choice node here. Charred Passions is far and away the most commonly used option in raid because a lot of the time you won't have stagger, you know, you're taunt swapping a boss back and forth, you might not have stagger rolling at all. Dragonfire Brew is entirely reliant on having a medium or high stagger pretty often in order to deal competitive damage. With that being said, it is a lot simpler talent. If you're taking a lot of damage, staggering a lot of damage, empowering your Dragonfire Brew with Blackout combo, like hitting Blackout Kick and then hitting Breath of Fire, it'll do a ton of damage. It will really add up to a lot of damage over the course of a Mythic Plus dungeon. In using Charred Passions, you have a more generically valuable talent that like isn't reliant on your stagger value being high at all, and instead it gives you more rotational complexity and more rotational requirement. Basically, you have to use Breath of Fire before you use Blackout Kick. Not every time, but you have to have that Charred Passions buff, that 8-second extra damage buff up each time you use Blackout Kick or Spinning Crane Kick. It's really important to have that to maximize your damage output. Both of these talents are pretty good. I would say Dragonfire Brew, the main reason it is so popular in Mythic Plus, it's very easy to use. It's very simple. So generally speaking, this is the go-to for most players. You can use Charred Passions if you're more comfortable using it from raid. That is actually my approach. I usually stick with Charred Passions, even if maybe it's not always the better choice. Certainly not the easier choice to use in every situation. I'm just more comfortable with it. And finally, there is the choice between Press the Advantage and Weapons of Order. This is the real, like, contentious thing among Brewmaster players. For high-level Mythic Plusers, Press the Advantage is all that gets used in theory crafting circles, and for newer players, less experienced players, the hard and fast recommendation is Weapons of Order. Weapons of Order, like on a basic surface level, seems more complex. You have to devote another keybind, you have to use a cooldown correctly, like time it out and maintain the buff and so on. But compared to properly performing the rotation so that you can use the 10-stack Rising Sun Kick buffs from Press the Advantage as soon as they come up, and they're all buffed with Blackout combo and Counter Strike so that they deal maximum damage and you're not wasting a single point of damage, Press the Advantage actually winds up being much more complex. And more importantly, it is a lot less forgiving. If you screw up with Press the Advantage, you're going to lose a lot of damage. If you screw up with Weapons of Order, you're probably going to be fine. Personally, I find that learning on Weapons of Order makes the most sense. I would do that if I were learning out. I would go Dragonfire Brew, Weapons of Order, keep that nice and simple. I probably would learn with Rushing Jadewind, though, to be honest. And I'd probably take Bob and Weave. A setup like this for somebody who is learning, and that is what I'm going to put in the recommendations there. This will be sort of a learning setup. And then for higher level, more experience, just, you know, kind of getting really comfortable with it, I would run Black Ox Brew, Press the Advantage, probably still stick with Dragonfire Brew though, to be honest. and go with this setup. I think it does wind up being a lot more fun and dealing a lot more damage once you've gotten the hang of using Press the Advantage really consistently, really well, never botching your rotation at any point. But there is that learning curve that you have to get over initially. And then finally, some of these other talents down here, Bountiful Brew, Storm Stout's Last Keg, Exploding Keg, all that stuff, pretty much mandatory. There used to be a recommendation to take like 1 point in High Tolerance instead of Blackout combo. That's basically gone away entirely. High Tolerance, it's a very generic bit of like extra stagger, extra haste. It's fine, but Blackout combo adds so much more damage by either being able to Blackout combo the things that you're buffing with Press the Advantage and get a lot more damage on your Rising Sun kicks, or just simply by being able to Blackout combo your Breath of Fire and get more damage and more damage reduction all the time. I mean, just that interaction alone is worth 5% more damage reduction all the time, which is buck wild for a talent and a hell of a lot better than High Tolerance on its own. So, considering that you can do other things with the Blackout combos as well, like get more brew cooldown reduction on your keg smashes, or I don't know, if you were running Weapons of Order, you could still Blackout combo like Tiger Palms and get a little bit more single target damage here and there. The Blackout combo is definitely the better option of those two. Okay, I think that covers talents. Monk has 2 rotations. We'll go over the Weapons of Order rotation first. It is the more normal rotation, the baseline that you should get familiar with, and then you can branch out from there. And let's just get right into it. Keg Smash, Rising Sun Kick, Blackout Kick, Breath of Fire, and Rushing Jadewind are your 5 main rotational skills, and you want to try to maximize your usage of them at all times. The key here is that Blackout Kick is the highest priority skill most of the time. You always want to keep at least 1 charge of Keg Smash on cooldown, but that's pretty easy, and after that you use Blackout Kick ahead of Rising Sun Kick and Breath of Fire and Rushing Jadewind. This might seem a little counterintuitive in single target since Rising Sun Kick deals a lot more damage than Blackout Kick, but basically the reasoning is that if you always prioritize Blackout Kick in spots where you have multiple good skills available, you will have fewer points in your rotation where none of those good skills are available, and then you're forced to hit Tiger Palm or Spinning Crane Kick. The rotation and cooldowns are complex, but the main rule of playing Monk is to not let abilities sit on cooldown. You can't cast all of them at once, so prioritizing them correctly is important, but if you manage to at least use all of your rotational abilities and cooldowns as much as you can, you're doing well. If you want to optimize your damage while using Charred Passions, be sure to always maintain that buff before hitting Blackout Kick, even if that means suspending your Blackout Kick cast by a global to use Breath of Fire first. That is okay. This is part of why high-level players will run Dragonfire Brew instead. It removes that complexity entirely, and when you're constantly taking tons of damage and having high stagger, Dragonfire Brew is a competitive talent. The issue with running it is that when you're not constantly getting smashed and having high stagger, you can lose a considerable bit of damage compared to running Charred Passions and then using it correctly, which is more complicated. Now let's go over the other rotation, the Press the Advantage setup. This is a talent that at first glance seems like it would make the class a lot simpler. It removes Tiger Palm and Weapons of Order, so you don't have to manage that rotational skill or that cooldown, and it just adds a stacking damage bonus onto every auto attack. Easy stuff, do your normal rotation and it just works. This is the simple rotation for the teeniest, tiniest babies, right? No. This is why the Monk class Discord is so strongly against this talent, despite it being overwhelmingly more popular among high-end players, and frankly, being a much more fun talent to use. Like, before I even move on, I recommend Press the Advantage if you're an experienced Monk. It is more fun than Weapons of Order, and you can do more damage with it if you use it correctly. But if you're inexperienced or uncomfortable with the class, you need to learn to walk before you can run. Because of the double hit that occurs when you hit 10 stacks of Press the Advantage and the interaction that Press the Advantage has with effects that increase the damage of your Tiger Palm casts, you have several setup components to using this talent. First off, in single target situations, you absolutely want to use every single 10 stack buff on Rising Sun Kick. But there is more to pay attention to. You also want to cast Blackout Kick beforehand so that you have Blackout combo available to buff that bonus Rising Sun Kick's damage. If you can hold on to a Counter-Strike buff from dodging an enemy auto attack, even better. In AoE situations, you want to use every 10 stack buff on Keg Smash, but you still want to buff that Keg Smash with Blackout combo and ideally Counter-Strike. The challenging part of managing this buff is that you need to learn to hold on to your Rising Sun Kick or Keg Smash, when you're around 7 to 9 stacks of Press the Advantage and plan to cast Blackout Kick right before you hit that PTA 10 stacks so you can immediately blast bosses with a 10 stack Rising Sun Kick for hundreds of thousands of damage without any delay, and without accidentally using it on Keg Smash instead. If you botch either of those, if you have to wait 9 seconds to get a Rising Sun Kick with 10 stacks, or you throw it on Keg Smash, you're wasting the damage, you're basically wasting the point of playing this spec. There's also a very annoying downside that Blizzard put in to save players from themselves in raid situations. When you pull a boss, your Press the Advantage stacks get cleared, no matter what. This is good for raiders. I would hate to feel compelled to set down training dummies and get to 10 stacks before every pull. Doing that for an entire raid tier would make me want to be buried alive in a coffin filled with bees. But in Mythic Plus, when you just innocently walk up to a Mythic Plus boss with 9 stacks of Press the Advantage and a desire to Rising Sun Kick their face into a pile of wet meat and broken teeth, the game says no, start at 0. Additionally, Press the Advantage is based on weapon swing time, and it is not balanced for two-handing versus dual wielding, so it will behave very differently depending on what type of weapon you're using. It stacks up way slower and is just generally less good as a two-hander, but it can be okay if you play it perfectly, and it's pretty good as dual wielding, but again, only if you use your 10 stack buffs correctly. It is a far less forgiving talent than Weapons of Order. I think the bottom line here is that even though I like it and I like the playstyle that it has generated, I find it fun, it's not a good talent. It's kinda bad. Now let's cover the main defensive skills. Purifying Brew is your most commonly used defensive skill. It reduces your incoming damage. You just treat it like a damage reduction skill, and you want to use it whenever your stagger value gets high. This tends to overlap with taking lots of damage, and this makes sense, right? If you take a lot of damage, you're gonna stagger a lot of damage. Using Purifying Brew is a skill you develop as you play Brewmaster Monk. It's probably the thing that players ask the most when starting out the class, but because you only remove 50% of your current stagger, it's not something you really need to micromanage. There are huge diminishing returns in using Purifying Brew multiple times in quick succession. You will want to stagger your Purify casts out. Using Purifying Brew every 8 to 10 seconds gets the job done in most situations, but hitting Purify anytime you suddenly take a lot of damage is a good skill to develop, a good rule to live by. Purifying Stagger will also increase the effect of your next Celestial Brew, granting it up to 200% extra shielding. And on the subject of Celestial Brew, it's a big ol' absorb shield. You should use it whenever you need to mitigate big, predictable burst damage from bosses. During trash pulls, it is more of a reactive skill. If there are mobs that deal big, predictable hits to the tank, then be sure to line that up to mitigate their hits, but otherwise you mainly just want to use it whenever your health suddenly drops low. Shield yourself and then use Expel Harm to heal back up. As for Expel Harm, it's your main heal. Use it pretty much anytime you need healing. I'm going to move on to cooldowns now. Touch of Death is the only offensive cooldown with any sort of special usage requirement, so I kind of want to start with it first because it's so weird. You can use the rest of your cooldowns as you like. The only time I really hold on to cooldowns is toward the end of pulls. I will always try to hold cooldowns for the start of a new pull. The only exception there is Touch of Death. You obviously can't use Touch of Death at the start of pulls. Enemies' health pools have to be low. So use that at the end of pulls or to kill off a high priority target. Bone Dust Brew's real cooldown is super short, the actual one, so unless a pull is about to end fairly soon, I usually don't hold that for the start of a new pull either. Whenever possible, you should try to overlap your cooldowns. This will make them deal a lot more damage. For example, an exploding keg that's just cast onto an enemy at random can do less than half the damage of an exploding keg that's thrown onto an enemy debuffed by Bone Dust Brew and Weapons of Order. This means you kind of have to think a bit like a damage dealer when you're using cooldowns and overlap them, and on-use trinkets if you have any stat trinkets, and obviously your stat potion as well to maximize your damage output. Another important note here, Exploding Keg deals extra damage for every single hit you land while its 3-second debuff is active, so before you cast it you should refresh Rushing Jadewind because all of the ticks from that count as hits. You should throw it out, and then you should follow it up by hitting Spinning Crane Kick 2 times in a row. You should try to do this each time you cast Exploding Keg in AoE. It is the most important aspect of maximizing the ability's damage per cast, and it is your biggest source of burst damage. It's also a pretty decent source of bonus healing or burst healing thanks to your tier set bonuses. This is purely an AoE damage concern though. In single target, you just refresh Rushing Jadewind, throw out Exploding Keg, and then continue your normal single target rotation. You don't need to double tap Spinning Crane Kick. Now let's run through defensive cooldowns. By default, you have Fortifying Brew and Zen Meditation. Celestial Brew also counts, but I've kind of already talked about that. Dampen Harm and Diffuse Magic are both options, but most monks won't have them in Mythic Plus since their passive alternatives are very good. In general, using Fortifying Brew at the start of a dangerous pull is a good approach. You can use it to boost your health in order to deal more damage with Touch of Death, but that doesn't really add a ton of damage, and that's really only something you should do if you're not being challenged defensively at all. You can use Fortifying Brew to mitigate dangerous boss mechanics as well, but that's usually where you would use Celestial Brew instead. You can overlap them though if you really need to. If you spec into Black Ox Brew, then you can have multiple Celestial Brew casts available in short succession. Beware that the second Celestial Brew cast will not have all the Purified Chi bonuses that you built up from Purifying Stagger, so it won't absorb as much damage as the first one, but a medium-sized shield is still better than no shield. You probably won't use Dampen Harm, but if you do, it's a pretty generic defensive cooldown. You kind of want to use it the same way you would with Fortifying Brew, but as a shorter, slightly weaker version of the same basic concept. Similarly, you probably won't be running Diffuse Magic, but if you are, it's a very strong but very brief cooldown that makes you really tanky against magic damage. It also dispels all magic debuffs and flips them back onto the enemy that casts them on you in the first place, which is pretty cool. Finally, Zen Meditation is by far the weirdest and hardest cooldown to use in any tank's kit. It can be really good for mitigating some very specific damage events, but you won't be able to dodge or parry any attacks while you're channeling it, so you're guaranteed to get hit. This will break the Zen Meditation immediately, so you can't use it while you're tanking normal situations. Instead, it really is only useful for mitigating predictable big boss spell cast just like Celestial Brew, but it is really good for that one specific purpose. Now let's talk about how to pull on a Brewmaster Monk. This is something I always specifically go over because I know pulling packs of mobs in dungeons can be challenging for newer players. Fortunately, Brewmaster Monks are actually pretty good at establishing initial threat, and it's really not that complicated. So in terms of starting out, you start out by casting Rushing Jadewind before you've even run into melee range or engaged with the pack. Use Keg Smash as soon as you are in range of enemies to cast it, and then follow up with Breath of Fire. If you hit the entire pack with the Keg Smash and Breath of Fire, you probably have threat established and you can go into your normal rotation. If you missed any of them, or you just have some mobs straggling trying to hit other people in your group, you can tag them with Spinning Crane Kick just to make sure you've hit everything in the group, and then specifically hit those mobs with Blackout Kick and Rising Sun Kick, and then proceed into your normal rotation. If you have Bone Dust Brew available, be sure to use it once you have the pack of enemies gathered up. The same goes for Summon White Tiger Statue. Bone Dust Brew is on the global cooldown and it doesn't do any damage or generate threat, so you don't want to use it until after you've locked threat up. You will want to use Bone Dust Brew and Weapons of Order early on in any pull that will last as long as, well, long enough to get their value out of them, so over 38 seconds for Weapons of Order and over, like 10 seconds for Bone Dust Brew. And once the enemy is debuffed with them, you want to hit them with an Exploding Keg for a humongous burst of damage. Be sure to use Rushing Jadewind and Spinning Crane Kick in order to maximize the value of that Exploding Keg. If you manage to do all of this, you will absolutely have threat locked down, and the pull should be good. Be sure to use Purifying Brew, Celestial Brew, and Expel Harm as needed to stay alive. Agility is your most important stat, so you always want to try to increase your item level first and foremost. When comparing similar item level pieces of gear, or thinking about enchants, gems, and crafted gear, you want versatility and crit, generally in that order. Mastery is pretty decent in Mythic Plus for reducing your auto attack damage taken, but it's not as consistent as versatility, and it's weaker for damage. Haste is kind of a bad stat by comparison with the other three, a noticeable step back in terms of value. Alright, let's wrap things up. Monk is a good tank right now. It's strong, it's fun, and it has good group utility. The main issue is that it just has a terrifying amount of keybinds. It's overwhelming for new players, and the reward for all the hard work required to master this massive class is that your damage output and tankiness are not bad. That's the problem. Would you put in the effort required to be an Olympic athlete if you knew your ceiling was 3rd place? Really good, one of the best to do it actually, but not the guy. I think that's hard for some people, most people really, to justify, and rightly so. It's significantly more work to play at the same level as other tanks, and the return on the effort isn't where it needs to be. The tuning is off. That's not the only issue either. Monks bring great group utility, but they bring the wrong flavor. Demon Hunter absolutely bodies Monk in terms of boosting group damage and providing useful crowd control in the context of the current design of Mythic Plus dungeons. But that doesn't mean Monk can't be good. It wouldn't take a lot from Blizzard for things to swing around really quickly. A Cataclysm-style debuff matrix consolidation would make a lot of community members, including myself, really happy. Merging the Monk and Demon Hunter debuffs into a basic 5% more damage taken debuff would be a great start. Almost as good of an idea as just scrapping the system itself. Doing that would immediately make Monk a lot more competitive in Mythic Plus. Shifting dungeons away from caster mob spam would also be good for the game in general. Tuning up Monk's damage numbers to reflect its archetype as a damage-first tank is long overdue. Monk is already in pretty good shape right now, so if Blizzard made any of these changes, I think they would be great. Despite the somewhat negative tone here, I'm feeling positive heading into Season 4 and the War Within. I don't think Blizzard needs to do a lot to get monks back to where they need to be. It's still a fun class, I still really like it, and I feel optimistic going forward. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.